go to their classes, they can, but if they want to see the first few minutes, that's okay. Now, that's a topic that has brought an awful lot of controversy in our society, isn't it? So where did all these supposed races come from? And where does skin color come from? And could Adam and Eve, just through their genes, have had all the skin colors we see out there today? And why are some areas dominated with one skin color? And which philosophy that is taught in every major college in America actually supports racism? But they never say it that way. Anyways, we've also got a flyer, if any of y'all like to have one of these, that goes along with this particular lesson on the first part about where all the skin colors come from. So can the Bible explain the origin of the races? Well, very simple. There's only one race, the human race. God made the world, and just a few words later it says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. Okay, there's one race, the human race. What's the problem? But typically when people use the word race today, they mean some cultural differences. The one that's the most common in our society is skin color. So here's another question. Where did Cain get his wife? Was she from a different race, quote unquote? You see, Adam didn't have just 3 kids. He didn't just have 3 boys. Remember, the third boy, Seth, was born when Adam was 130 years of age. He probably had quite a few kids by that time. But did he stop? No. Because Genesis 5:4 says, in the days of Adam, after he had fathered Seth, were 800 years. And he fathered sons and daughters. So most likely Cain married a sister. What's the problem? Okay? Even the historian Josephus, he's not inspired, okay? Historian Josephus said the number of Adam's children, it says the old tradition, was 33 sons and 23 daughters. Ladies, raise your hand if you'd like to have 50-some kids. But if you're going to live for 930 years, at least Adam did, we don't know how long Eve lived, but that wouldn't be a whole lot, would it? You see, Eve, according to what the Bible says, in Genesis 3:20, Adam called his wife Eve because she was a mother of all living. So where Cain got his wife only has one possibility, from Eve. Had to come through Eve somewhere, right? So someone might say, can you marry your relation? Well, you better be marrying a human. So you are marrying your relation. But another question is this, can you legally marry a close blood relative? Not today. It used to be illegal. There was nothing against it, but not today. Remember, even Romans 4:15 says, where there is no law, there is no transgression. So there was no law against close marriages until when? Let's go look at a timeline here. Here we got Genesis. We got the whole world cursed because of Adam and Eve's sin. Okay? So there it's cursed. And so in each generation, we know that they pass down genetic mistakes. Because when your body tries to make a copy of 3.3 billion base pairs in a DNA code, it makes some mistakes. Oh, don't worry. You got machinery in there that goes out and replaces the mistakes. But sometimes it doesn't get it corrected completely. So they had a few more mutations, but Adam and Eve probably had perfect genes. No mistakes. So intermarriage, marrying a brother or sister, is no big deal. No big deal for almost 2,500 years. But after 2,500 years, who said there's too many genetic mistakes in your gene pool? Well, he didn't say it that way. He just said, don't marry close relatives. And he gave example after example after example in Leviticus chapter 18. It's clear. God understands genetics. Remember, he's the one who made of one blood all the nations on the earth. Now, in one sense, you say, racism, it actually makes no sense whatsoever. We all have the same skin color. You don't believe me? I mean, anybody else here got a different skin color? You see, we all have melanin. Unless you have a genetic mutation that's for albinos. If you ever look at someone's albino, you're looking right through the skin because the skin likes to be transparent. Unless you have this chemical called melanin. Technically speaking, it's two different amounts of slightly different melanins, but never mind, okay? And the geneticists go with these gene codes called A's and B's and C's. We'll get there in just a minute, okay? Your body has these things called melanocytes that creates this melanin that allows you to create more and more darker skin color. And the sun actually helps activate some of that and encourages more skin color also, okay? Those melanocytes, or at least the melanin-producing sections right here, you see in this diagram, from your skin all the way to the hair follicles. So let's do what the physicist does. You say, physicist? Isn't that complicated? Yes. Physicists often look at complicated things. But the first thing the physicist does is it simplifies. You simplify, simplify, simplify. If you first understand how the simple model works, then you can add in the extra variables later. Makes it a whole lot easier. So let's simplify. Instead of talking about 2 or 3 genes for melanin, let's just start off with one, okay? Let's say we got one gene that codes for melanin. And that one gene comes in 2 versions. One's called a dominant version, another one's called a recessive version. The dominant version just means it codes for more melanin than the recessive copy, okay? That's all it means. So what we might have is a diagram like this. Since the parents pass down to their children one copy of each to the children, each child then has 2 copies of this gene, okay? So if the father has capital A, in other words, dominant type of this gene, and the mother has capital A, then what kind of kids are they going to have? Okay. Well, what if the parents have little a, little a? Little a's code for the least amount of melanin, so they end up with kind of what we call white skin, okay? Well, if both Adam and Eve, or in this particular case, this man and this woman, if they both have little a, what can they pass on to their kids? The only thing they can pass on to their kids is light skin. Well, what if each parent had a capital A and a little a? Well, then they could pass down to the kids these varieties. One child would be with just capital A, be the darkest skin possible. Those middle 2 would be kind of a medium brown color. And then the one all the way to your right, little a, would be the lightest skin color possible. Okay. So now we understand the principle. Generally, geneticists say there's 2 genes. They use the letters A and B. So now instead of just having 2 varieties, we've got A and B in capital letters and lowercase letters, as you see in what's called a Punnett square that we all took in biology class that I don't even remember taking myself, but anyways, it was there, okay? And now they think they found a 3rd gene. So never mind, A, B, and then C, okay? Generally, the idea is like this. The more of this pigment that you have, melanin, the more to the left that you get up on this diagram, okay? Less, the more to the right. So Adam and Eve, could they have had the darker, the medium colors, slightly less medium color, and the lighter colors? Could they have had that? Well, if melanin is controlled by genes, and let's say it's capital A, capital B, little b, well, then that would be the middle color right here, right? What if it's capital A, capital B, capital B? Well, there on the left, that'd be the darkest skin color possible. And little a, little b, little b be the lightest skin color possible. So what can we say about Adam and Eve? If Adam and Eve were both capital A, capital A, capital B, they'd have been very dark skin color, wouldn't they? And what would have every single one of their children have been? Capital A, capital A, capital B, the darkest skin color. So what can we say for absolute surety? Adam and Eve weren't black. Oh, that's politically incorrect. You can't say that. Don't worry. If you actually go through the statistics, you end up offending everybody. Okay? So what if Adam and Eve were little a, little b, little b? Well, that would be the whitest, the lightest skin color out there, right? What would all their children be? The lightest skin color out there. Well, what do we know? Adam and Eve were not pearly white, pale white. And I'll show you in a minute how that's a negative, but never mind. But what if Adam and Eve were capital A, capital B, little b? Then there'd be a kind of a medium brown, right? Similar to some people we might see over in India today or the Middle East, things of that nature, right? What would their children be? Wow, look at that. The darkest color possible, not quite so dark, middle brown, lighter brown, and whatever you want to call white, okay? So if we could get all those variations, remember, there's actually 3 genes, so you even have a more different combinations you can have in that there. And there's technically 2 types of melanin. One's a slightly more reddish pigment than the other, which would explain the American Indians with their redder, more reddish pigment, okay? All those variations right there could be in Adam and Eve. So if someone ever says, how do you explain all the skin colors across the world with the Bible? You say, no problem. In fact, they'll probably ask you like this. How could Noah and his family have had all those skin colors? Say, listen, we got Adam and Eve can have all the skin colors. We got no problem. You give us 8 people. It's even easier. And then you get to the Tower of Babel, and they would have spread all over the world. Now, India has some people there that has some, well, it's not so rare for them to have the following combinations. From the lightest color skin to some of the darker color skins, all in the same culture. How do you like that family? Those are twins. I'll show you a color picture in just a minute. How about them? Does that baby look like it's a little lighter color than mom and dad? Yeah. What about this family? It's in the genes, folks. There's those 2 babies I showed you earlier. They're twins. And here they are 7 years later. You mean it just takes the right genes to have all the different skin colors? You can have it in one family? Yes. But typically one shade or color dominates a particular area because of other reasons, but we won't get into that. Some people are even prejudiced against people from Asian countries. Did you know that? Racism against eyes? Because one eye happens to have a fatty layer and the other one doesn't? Yeah. Remember, God made the world and he made from one blood every nation to dwell on the face of the earth. You see, the prohibition against this intermarriage, what's this intermarriage? You gonna marry a human or not? No really such thing as intermarriage. Unless you want to break it down in certain boundaries. Like Solomon, he really shouldn't have married those foreign wives, okay? So in that sense, you can say intermarriage, okay? But the way our culture uses that term today, there's no such thing. But socially, some countries do this, and it's not unusual. Remember Rahab, she married an Israelite. She sure wasn't. What about Ruth? She married Boaz. And they're both on a lineage to Christ. There's nothing wrong with it. You see, by all men shall know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Love has no place for what the culture calls racism. I backed up just there. U.S. Christian heritage. That's a picture of the Pilgrims. Now, when the Pilgrims came over here, I think a lot of you all already know this, but I'll just repeat it. The Pilgrims were members of the Church of Christ. We know where they came from. We know who their preacher was. We know what the elders were in the congregation. whether they were in Massachusetts, everything, okay? But not everybody on the Mayflower was a biblical Christian. About half of them weren't. So they had to set up a government to where everybody could get along. What kind of government did they set up? Well, you might find it interesting. In 1607, when Jamestown was started, well, let's first talk about the slave trade. What happened with the slave trade is that there were certain tribes of people down in Africa that had been putting each other into slavery for hundreds, if not thousands of years, okay? And in comes these Englishmen on their ships, and so they would sell some of the other natives that they'd taken captive and made slaves. They'd sell them to these Englishmen to get whiskey and alcohol and all those kind of things. So then they'd pack them on these ships. They'd then head south. The winds would then blow them westerly. They come up the coast of America, and then they would sell the slaves. Because after all, America was under the King of England, and he forced slavery on the Americas. It was forced on the colonies. They didn't want it. So what happened when they came up the coast and they would sell the slaves for money, which then later, of course, they take back to England and buy more alcohol and head on another round and have money left over. That's very profitable, okay? So when they would come to Jamestown, they'd sell the slaves. Well, what happened when they got up to the Pilgrims? Well, in the first ship got up to the Pilgrims, and they tried to sell the slaves to the Pilgrims. You know what the Pilgrims did? They said, this is wrong. The captain, the officers, you're put in jail, and we set the slaves free. Why? They said the principle is in the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 21. In fact, now the Pilgrims are about 1620, right? Even as late as 1641, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, okay, the 10th capital crime in their legal code said that if any man stealeth a man or mankind, he shall surely be put to death. And then they cited Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. As part of their law. This went completely against the king. King didn't like this at all. You see, man-stealing was interpreted by the New England colonists to include what they considered as improper enslavement. And for us to read Exodus chapter 21 a bit more accurately, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he was found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. I don't think they put the captain and the other guys to death. I'm not saying they instituted Old Testament laws. Okay. But they knew the principle, and it was wrong. What about the founders of this country? You see, half the founders were also members of abolitionist societies. You're not taught that today, are you? In fact, I think it was Amazon has got this new movie out, 1619, and it distorts history like crazy. Be careful what they try to teach in school as history. Make them go back to original resource documents, not some professor that wrote a book a couple decades ago. Here's John Adams. Well, he was an attorney before he got into politics, right? And while he was an attorney, he said this: I was concerned in several causes in which the Negroes sued for their freedom before the Revolution. I never knew a jury, by a verdict, to determine a Negro to be a slave. They always found them free. King George didn't like it, and if you were to go to the Declaration of Independence, the original draft, okay, the original draft by Thomas Jefferson, the original draft that was accepted by everybody, all the colonies except two. They didn't like this particular grievance. It was the longest grievance against the king that was ever stated. But because two of the colonies wouldn't go along with it, they left it out of the final draft. That particular statement was King George has forced slavery upon us. It's against God. It's against morality. That needs to be stopped. And there's plenty more references. If someone comes up to you today and says, oh, what you all heard that night is not correct, I've got some technical references. You can go download the articles for yourself. Just go to the coronavirus better news thing that you all know about, okay? third paragraph there says the Bible has a solution for many of man's challenges and questions: skin color, racism, Hitler's evolutionary views, all kinds of things. Now, what actually makes racism worse in a culture? Turns out, that book. You see, today, when you go try to get a copy of on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, guess what they do today? They leave off that long title. They don't want you to know Darwin was a racist. Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. Thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. Darwin thought natives were just advanced animals. Now, Darwin did not like slavery, but he thought the Negroes were closer to the apes. That's what he thought. That's what he taught. That's what he wrote. Okay? And some people don't want to believe that. We'll give you an exact quote later, okay? But for right now, this is a paraphrase of a quote from Darwin. Darwin hoped that by means of preservation of favored races, and that's the key, preservation. Hitler jumped all over that idea of preservation. The people in Germany before Hitler jumped all over that idea of preservation. That's the key, preservation of favored races. The biological gap between species will be more like the distance between the white man and the baboon. In other words, there's a big distance between the white guy and the baboon. But look at this. Instead of the closely related, as Darwin views it, the black man and the gorilla. Yeah, I'd say he's a racist, isn't he? Now, here's the irony to this whole thing. It actually is extremely kind of humorous. Racism. The one trait that people use to put people with dark skin into a category that they consider as inferior is the one trait that proves darker skinned people are superior. They have better skin. If you don't believe that, let's go to the National Institute of Health. Fully documented, medical literature, no problem. Caucasian skin. Boy, these don't look like positives, do they? Caucasian skin is exemplified by thinner and less cohesive stratum corneum. Reduced skin extensibility, along with the loss of collagen and the disorganization of the elastic fibers in the dermis with increasing age. These attributes result in clinically fragile skin and contribute to the aging process. So, you get the point, okay? Preservation of favored races, who should have been the favored race? The black should have been the favored race. But that's not what they wanted to believe, so they came up with something else. Hitler's book was full of this racist philosophy, Mein Kampf. In fact, an atheist, an evolutionist who researched Hitler had to admit this: the German Führer has consistently sought to make the practice of Germany conform to the theory of evolution. You don't find the evolutionists admitting to that today. They try to cover it up. So does the media, so does academia. Here's Hitler's speech to a bunch of officer cadets. Nature is always teaching us that she is governed by the principle of selection, that victory is to the strong and the weak must go to the wall. War is therefore the unalterable law of the whole of life. You see, in Hitler's mind, and all the racist evolutionists at that particular time, the most common thing for them was, if you and I go into a war together, one nation against another, whoever wins is obviously superior. Therefore, war causes the human race to get better over time. That's the way they justified war. And it wasn't started by Hitler. That's just what he was taught. We weren't doing too well in the United States in 1859, were we? Because in the 1820s, certain things dominated our political system, And then until the Civil War, things were really bad. Slaves, yeah. And yet, even with all that bad history, do they ever bother to tell you every single nation on this planet has or had slavery in its own history? America is the one country in the world that fought a war to set the slaves free in the fight against racism. They're the only country in the world that lost 600,000 soldiers to set the slaves free. We tried to get rid of it earlier, but again, it cost us a lot. Now, a black friend, Jaden, he actually said this. He says he knows that America is the least racist country on the planet today. And here's his argument. And he happens to be black, mechanical engineer, okay? And he said, the one country that black people want to go to is America. If it's such a racist country, why in the world do they want to come here? Good point. You see, with 300 million people in the United States, you can find evil, any evil you want. But how does that prove the whole country is evil? Or it's based upon evil? Or the police department is based upon evil? Or anything? You can find hundreds of thousands of policemen. There's going to be someone doing something wrong. That doesn't make all the other policemen bad, right? I kind of say the same thing with some politicians, but never mind. Okay. You see, while our streets are filled with protests, the media and schools still teach evolution, which the racist have used for over 100 years to scientifically justify their racism. Huh? Now here's the irony. Evolution is no more scientific than racism is scientific. Now let's see if the media or colleges ever mention this connection between evolution and racism. Henry Fairfield Osborn, okay? He's just an American paleontologist, museum administrator. The standard intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of an 11-year-old youth of the species Homo sapien. He's the museum curator. Boy, that's nice. I wonder what kind of displays he made. No rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is equally, still less superior to that of white man. Now, why is it off the screen? Sorry. Thomas Huxley was considered as Darwin's bulldog. He was the one that got it popularized. Okay? The black people of Australia, exactly the same race as the African Negro, cannot take in the gospel. What? All attempts to bring them to a knowledge of the true God has yet failed utterly. Poor brutes in human shape, they must perish off the face of the earth. This is done by an Anglican priest. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, today we have some of that. I was an Anglican priest back in the 1800s. Look at this. I attended Teaching Evolution seminar yesterday, led by Eugene Scott. Now, Eugene Scott is the head of probably the number one organization in the United States that tries to make sure creation of the Bible is kept out of the schools. She hates God and the Bible. So when someone was asking, how do you answer students when those students believe the Bible? Look what she said. The teachers were advised to suggest to the Bible believers to consult their clergy, who would usually assure them that belief in evolution is okay. Darwinism was used to justify slavery. This particular quote, I just want to see the parts in yellow. Contrary to popular belief, racism did not cause New World slavery, but rather slavery exacerbated racism as people looked for justification for their practices. Darwin gave the slavery lobby the ultimate and scientific justification to claim that blacks were subhuman. It was simple. They had not yet evolved as far towards humanness as whites. Now, in case you think these are some obscure things from some, you can always find some evolutionary scientists say these stupid things, right? No, this is common. Let's show you Stephen Jay Gould. This is the #1 evolutionist in all of America. Well, he died a few years ago, so now he knows he's wrong. Just a Harvard professor. He was also a communist Marxist, and he was their leading evolutionist, wrote for the leading publications. Okay? Even he admitted this. Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. What is orders of magnitude? For most people, we don't deal with the idea of orders of magnitude. He knows what that means. Let me explain, make sure you know it. Magnitude, just think of the number 10. Orders basically said, notice he used the plural. He didn't say order of magnitude greater. He said orders, which means, since it's in the plural, it's at least 2 or greater, right? So orders of magnitude means you take 10 and you raise it to the 2 or greater power. Well, 10 raised to the second power is already 100. So what is he saying? Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by 100 times or more following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Darwin once said, at some future period, not very distant. Now, he's dying around, I think, 1880s. So some future period, not very distant. Wrote his book in 1859. Not very distant, as measured by century, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Well, guess what? Just a few decades later, what was the justification? Talking about even as the Caucasian and some ape as low as baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. And Descent of Man, page 178. So what happened just a few decades later? Remember, I said Hitler didn't start this. In Germany, they caught on to the idea of the superior race by genetics, evolution. That means war helps drive humanity upward, improvements. You got to get rid of all the inferiors. Even if the inferiors were only 3% behind you. Get rid of them because they'll slow you down. Get rid of all inferior races. And I'll show you a list if we get there. I probably won't have time to get there. Give you Hitler's list of actually which categories. So before Hitler, in Germany, World War I, 20 million people died because of that philosophy. Or I should say that philosophy encouraged what happened and became known as World War I. 21 million wounded. World War II, Hitler, 72 million. The Holocaust, somewhere between 7 and 26 million. You realize he killed more than just the Jews. He killed millions of others in the Holocaust. What about Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin? They just killed 15 million people of their own people. What about Joseph Stalin? 20 million. China, Mao Zedong, 14 million to 20 million. Pol Pot, he killed about 1/3 of his country. And are we doing any better today? Looks like I used a font that didn't work on my version of PowerPoint here. Sorry, my mistakes here, okay? Abortion, China estimates 300 million babies. Russia, 280 million babies. Just since 2014, in the U.S., almost 57 million babies. And there's a couple other countries on the slide. The philosophy that we're nothing but animals, evolution is true, leads to those type of actions. Genesis shows us that men and women are created in the image of God and have intrinsic value that cannot be taken away. So what happens when people fail to acknowledge God as creator and don't glorify him as such? Well, in Romans chapter 1, Paul says, they give up a lot. That kind of summarizes it. Racism in Australia, what did they do to the Aborigines? Take a look here. They took 45, basically, the mounted police comes in and kills dozens of Aboriginal men, women, and children. Why? Because somebody wanted their skulls for scientific research, to be put in museums. Who would want that? 45 heads were boiled down and the 10 best skulls were packed off for overseas. Overseas where? Well, the Smithsonian has 33,000 human remains in the National Museum of Natural History. The scientists in those days wanted that. Some leaders taught that the Aborigines were not as evolved as the white man. Oh, they got bigger jaws. That proves they're closer to something. Okay. And they would put them in chains, haul them off, kill them. 1904, World's Fair. Special display was put up with some monkeys and animals in there in a cage, and they put this guy in there also. To show the people it's just like an animal, just like the monkeys, right? This is World's Fair, United States. 1912, Woodrow Wilson. What do you mean he segregated the U.S. government? Wasn't it already segregated before that? No. Let me give you an example. U.S. envoys, Libya, Haiti, as well as the Register of the Treasury had traditionally been blacks. Wilson replaced them all with whites, denying blacks even the tiniest bit of political advantage. Sorry the font goes off the screen, because he also was one of the instigators of helping the Ku Klux Klan get started and built up to its highest numbers during his administration. He even showed the Klan movie at the White House. The first movie ever shown at the White House was a Klan movie. Woodrow Wilson. Yes, the birth of the nation. Woodrow Wilson. Well, he thought the Indians were inferior. Bob Jones University Press, they even admit it in the textbooks, even on Roosevelt. 1871, Congress scrapped all the treaties with the Indians and stuck them on the reservations. Were they all savages? Well, no, the Cherokees in 1828 were not nomadic savages. In fact, they had assimilated many European-style customs, including wearing of gowns by the Cherokee women. They built roads, schools, and churches, and had a system of representational government, and were farmers and cattle ranchers. Raise your hand if you ever heard of Davy Crockett. Where'd he die? The Alamo, Texas. What was he doing down there? He was in the U.S. Congress. What's he going down to Texas? Because he quit the government. He tried to stand up for the Cherokees, got so much flack, he finally just forget, I'm out of here, going back to Texas. Yeah. And what happened to the Indians was really sad, especially the Trail of Tears. In Malachi 2:10, it talks about dealing treacherously with a man against his brother, but never use that font again. That's a font I copied from a lesson I did 15, 20 years ago, most of this. Remember, God made of all nations, one blood, all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. And even Leviticus 19 has the same principle. If the stranger with you is in your land, you shall not mistreat him, and you shall love him as yourself. Now, what did Darwin think? Well, he thought women were inferior. Have you ever heard the media admit that? Oh, you're not going to hear that today, are you? And then he compared a married man is a poor slave, worse than a Negro. Huh? Here's a quote from him. The chief distinction and intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can the woman. Chopped off the bottom. whether requiring deep thought, reason, imagination, or merely the use of the senses and the hands. The average mental power in man must be above that of woman. Page 586. Page 588. And thus man has ultimately become superior to woman. Poetry, strength, voice, etc. Try putting that across the New York Times headlines today. How many riots will they have to get rid of Darwinism out of the textbooks in schools? That would be great, wouldn't it? Yeah. Darwin believed in inbreeding. You mean he didn't bother to follow the laws that God had already instituted in Leviticus chapter 18? Didn't follow? No. He thought inbreeding was okay. In fact, he was trying to have a superior race himself. So, of course, he's superior, right? So he married his maternal father's granddaughter, who was also his mother's niece, to produce superior stock. They had 10 kids. Mary, she died shortly after birth. Annie, which some people say when Annie died, that's what gave Darwin his last straw with God. Didn't sound like he was doing too well before this anyways. So Annie dies at age 10. Robert was born retarded, died in 19 months. Henrietta had a serious breakdown at age 15, and 3 of his 6 other sons were so ill so often that Charles regarded them as semi-invalids. Don't marry close relatives. When you look at the human genome product, human beings are incredibly similar. 99.888%. I mean, evolution is a philosophy that's a foundation for racism, Nazism, communism, and socialism. They let man say to himself, ye shall make the rules. You are the highest authority. Essentially, it sounds like, ye shall be as gods. Remember the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28? Because of his riches, he's lifted up. Because of his beauty, became prideful. Or for all this in the world, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, doesn't lead to good things, does it? 1 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Sometimes people who have a lot of money, such as John D. Rockefeller or Carnegie, they didn't use their money wisely. They often used it to support evolutionary teaching in the colleges and universities of their day. Of course, that's what they were taught, right? Evolution, the founding philosophy for communism and humanism. Here's some quotes. Communism based on evolution theory that removes God from authority and puts man in his place. So Christians, we try to carefully plant seed in someone's heart. Remember the parable of the different types of souls? So Mark 4 and 15, you try to plant the seed, and some of it falls by the wayside. Well, what falls by the wayside, what did Jesus say? Well, Jesus basically said the devil is going to swoop down and remove the seed from their hearts. Well, what about countries? Instead of just individual, could this also be similar to countries? What is Satan's number one target on this planet? He's not going after France that hard. He's had them since the Enlightenment period in the late 1700s. He's not going after Spain. He had them even before that. England's already gone downhill so far. Oh. Who's the number one country on the planet that at least gives some honor to God more than any other country? United States of America. That's who he's going after. How does he go after us? Well, he uses other people. If you want the documentation, whew, boy, is it documented. During the Cold War, the highest government official that ever defected came over to the United States. Of course, he has to stay in hiding now because they're trying to kill him, okay? He gives a documentation of what Russia was trying to do. So the devil's simply using Russia to go do his biddings. Russia has a whole department called the Disinformation Department. That department has more people in it than the military. In fact, in the early 1900s, they even sent 4 this would be 1960s or 1970s. They sent over 4,000 spies down into the Muslim countries with copies of an old lie of a book about Jews to spread hatred to the Jews and therefore hatred of America that supports Israel. A lot of the things you see today that's been going on for decades, it's nothing but Russia trying to get everybody to split up America, causes division, things of that nature. And they've got a bunch of ways to do it. ACLU, the founder of the ACLU says communism is the goal. Okay? Karl Marx, when he was young, he wrote a paper on his love for the Lord. Goes off to college, turns his back on God. He says, my objective in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism. Karl Marx. The philosophy of communism is based upon evolution. He wrote a letter to his friend Engel and said that The Origin of Species was the book which contains the basis in natural history for our theory. He didn't do too well. He had 6 children, 3 died of starvation in infancy, 2 others committed suicide. And when he died, this is a very famous guy, right? People across the entire world are reading his books. 6 people show up for his funeral. Now, another report said 9 people showed up. Yeah. Communist Manifesto, 1848. Since we're getting ready to have the second bell, I won't have time to go through each one of these. If you look through those, you say, looks like America has already had most of these accepted in our culture. And remember, 1848, or you can go to another book by the communists in 1950, might be 1958. Same type book called The Naked Communist. And there's another person who went to a communist meeting in California in 1992. These same lists were there. This is how you destroy America. You do these things. They already got us mostly there. You see when it says abolish private property? Well, what does the Bible say about private property? Jesus condemned people who said you can't go spend your money how you want to spend it. He called them evil. Isn't that what the parable means here? When the people in the parable that he gave, they were complaining because he gave one people more money. He gave everybody the same amount of money, but some people worked more than the others. Or in the Old Testament, we're talking about people having their own vine, their own fig tree. And yet we got people who want to object to private property. And then we teach children this. Bear with me just a minute. I pledge allegiance to the world, to care for the earth, sea, and air, to honor every living thing with peace and justice everywhere. And that's for 3rd graders in Wisconsin public schools. And we could keep on going through these type of lists. But let me stop here. That reminds me, I'm grateful this world is not our home. I don't want to fight this. I don't want to live in the middle of this ridiculousness, okay? But we are supposed to fight for Christianity, fight for the truth. Why? Because there's that rare individual in America. Remember, I've said this too many times. Wide path to destruction, narrow path to eternal life, right? Which means when you go onto Google and search for information, most of the articles are written by people going to hell. That's what wide path means, isn't it? So we as Christians are looking for those few people who have developed a fear of God and a love for the truth to be willing to give up whatever they might think or have been taught to follow what the evidence shows. So we need to show them the evidence for God, and then the evidence that man has come along and had many false